Let's face it, hiring help is not easy these days. Let XenTegra Staffing help you find the right person for the right job. Head over to XenTegra.com/XenTegra Staffing to find out more and let us staff your people needs. Welcome to another Citrix session with your host, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton, your source for all things Citrix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Citrix session podcast. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I do this, I think, every single time I jump on these things and forget which number we're on. This must be 11 or 12, but I'm sure the notes will clarify that. I'm lucky enough to have Kevin Nardone with us. Kevin and I go way back, and Kevin's already joined us one time before, and we went over Citrix on Azure and what Citrix brings to Azure. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, definitely go back and do that. But kind of what spawned that podcast was Kevin's webinar with the guys from Microsoft around Citrix on Azure. And from that followed up a blog that Kevin put together that had Q&A that addressed that webinar based on the questions that came in afterwards. So Kevin, welcome to the podcast again.
Yeah, Andy, thanks very much for having me. Always a pleasure.
It's like I was telling you a minute ago, we can do this with you once a month. I know you're one of the lead architects for Citrix on Azure, which is a very big topic. Is it just Azure or is it the other clouds as well?
Azure is my specialty, but I've experience in AWS and then least of which GCP. So that's how I would rank it: Microsoft, Amazon, Google. But been dealing with all three for quite some time, especially prior to the role I'm in now. When I was the service provider architect, a lot of our service providers actually host their entire business on Amazon.
Yeah.
And that's a handful of lessons learned there that we can share for another meeting.
You know what? I'm after the record button is hit and turned off later, I'm going to ask you some CSP questions because I've got some there that they've just been gnawing at me all weekend, and I want to get some answers. So that's good.
Perfect.
I do have a question regarding the cloud concepts, Azure, GCP, AWS, and I just feel like the way Microsoft is positioning the licensing around their technologies that go into these clouds that play into the virtual app and desktop world, that they are really just setting themselves up to own this market. Windows 10 multi-session being one, and you may go into that here in a second. But how are the other guys going to compete with Microsoft Azure if Microsoft's stacking the deck licensing from a licensing perspective?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I know when it comes to licensing, we tend to press on our alliances team to coordinate that with Microsoft if there's any questions. So it's not something I'm too familiar with in terms of the logistics, but I know at least when it comes to the concept of running on a dedicated host, and really Microsoft made the change primarily due to what they considered loopholes in some of their existing licensing terms. And based on, and I can send you a summary of this later because we had a conversation with another customer, but based on at least, closing that loophole, what they did is they also now have like software assurance of license mobility that still enables customers to still use those dedicated host offerings and bring their own licensing. But yeah, anything Microsoft obviously is changing licensing play, and it's something they, like you mentioned, they're using the fact that they're the creators of the OS to their advantage. But it's something that I'd always recommend working with, the Microsoft rep of that specific account or within your organization if you're a listener. But it's interesting. I'm very curious to see how it continues to go. I mean, when you kind of look at things like, even Amazon does it to a degree in like the other sides of their business with like their sales platform. Now you go and you want to buy paper towels, they'll reference the Amazon brand first compared to like, Bounty or things along those lines. And then Google with advertisements, they'll do something similar. So it sounds, Microsoft is kind of following suit in a way when you think of those other models or those other companies in different parts of their business units. But Yeah, it's interesting. And I think a lot of customers are still looking at AWS GCP for multiple reasons and just working through the new terms accordingly.
Yes, I think what we just talked about there in terms of Microsoft terminology was, Office 365 subscriptions and how those are turning into Microsoft 365 subscriptions. So AKA O365 turning into M365 and how that's going to play in the virtual app and desktop space is going to be interesting. And I do see it becoming a Microsoft world where they're taking advantages of all the loopholes that maybe they did in the past that, the other guys started taking advantage of. So now it's just fair for them to do the same thing. So let's kind of kick this off a little bit. So you did the Azure Citrix on Azure workshop webinar a few months ago, or probably 2 months ago now. Time's flying. But as part of the follow up to that, on the Citrix guidepost, the cloud guidepost or Citrix guidepost that you guys are doing that we talked about with Michelle last week, you posted a Q&A on that, and so
Yes.
you want to just give a kind of an overview of the document that we're getting ready to go through?
Yeah, so the tips webinars too, and I'll kind of take a step back and talk about the overall program. One of the advantages of that whole webinar series is also towards the end, we really strive to have 10 or more minutes of a live Q&A with, the expert panel, whether it be myself, other members of my team, vendors, like I know Microsoft typically joins me for the Citrix on Azure series. And a lot of times, questions, like any Q&A session on a hot topic, it tends to run long. So what we try to do after those technology and practice webinars is post a Q&A blog that captures some of the key topics that most customers are asking for or asking about. So, that overall blog is really a summary of what were the key themes of questions that came out of the webinar. Let's, put the answers all in one single location so that, a customer can always reference this if they watch the webinar and then want to take a look and get some of their questions answered.
So I think I screwed this up. So you have Michelle talked last week about two concepts. One is Citrix tips, and the other is the cloud or the Citrix guidepost, cloud guidepost. I refer to this one being part of the cloud guidepost series. This one's actually part of the Citrix tips series. Your Q&A here, right?
Yep. Yeah. So tips, guideposts, very, both different forms of technical enablement. I think the difference with the tips is that a lot of it's driven by architects on like myself on our consulting team. Whereas the guidepost is a mix of architects, customer success engineers, escalation engineers, sales engineers. That looks into just technical landscape across the entire organization versus, the in practice of, we're doing a project on this technology, let's share lessons learned. But the overall, goal of customer success is the same across both series.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, let's jump into the questions. The first one is, what is Windows Virtual Desktop and what does it entail? I love this question because so many people are confused about what Windows Virtual Desktop is and then what the overall concept of an enterprise virtual desktop in Azure that is an entitlement of M365. So let's hear you explain it. I want to hear your version of that story.
Yeah. So, and this was, when we originally kicked off that tips, one of the things that Jeff Mitchell and I, who's, the colleague from Microsoft I normally collaborate with, wanted to dive into that head first. And just like Citrix Cloud being a platform to consume, virtual app and desktop service, unified endpoint management, all of the Citrix technologies, Windows Virtual Desktop is the same concept for Microsoft. It's a platform where a customer can use existing Microsoft entitlements to get access to new capabilities on Azure. So, for example, the Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session, FS Logics for Office 365 optimization, as well as using that existing licensing entitlement if there have Windows 7 workloads that need extended security updates, being able to host those using those existing licenses on Azure is part of the program as well. So just like Citrix Cloud, it's really an overall platform for Microsoft to deliver a lot of different like you mentioned before, M365 services, and will continue as to develop over time.
So Kevin,
the one big difference though is Citrix, and this actually gets into the next question. Maybe we can jump into that one before I clarify that I have to repeat myself.
Well, before you go there, I want to make this statement because it's been a very popular topic as XenTegra for the past months now. I think it's very important that if you work in today's enterprise IT world, as it relates to cloud, you have to know the difference between IaaS, infrastructure as a service, PaaS, platform as a service, and SaaS, software as a service. And in this case, we're talking about Azure, which is really IaaS, but the Windows Virtual Desktop Service, which is the brokering and the creation kind of sort of service that goes along with a virtual desktop world, is a platform as a service. So you're not actually running your desktops on WVD. WVD is the enabler to allow you to run your desktops on top of Azure, which is your IaaS, to ultimately, in a roundabout way, provide software as a service to your end user. So it's the clouds coming together, and I use plural because the cloud, it's not a cloud, it's clouds, and I must say that 100 times a week. But it's very clear that Citrix Virtual App and Desktop Service, or Citrix Workspace Premium Plus service, and I keep throwing service on the end of there because that's the key term, and WVD service is really a PaaS, platform as a service, like you were talking about.
Exactly, and that's where the licensing. So thinking of breaking those down in the three different models, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. What that existing Microsoft entitlement is getting you is the platform. So like hosting those virtual desktop workloads in Azure, you still need to consume and pay for the infrastructure as a service. So even though you're not, you're getting like the Linux-based instance pricing, for example, because that Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session license is included with, say your M365 license, there is still a cost to use that platform in a way of, hey, I need to host my workload somewhere. And Citrix, when it comes to our integration with WVD, we're actually using our brokering and our session management. And then Microsoft is actually, from our partnership, giving us entitlement to be a preferred partner for using and brokering Windows 10 Enterprise multi-session.
So let me ask you a question on that. So you called it WVD, Citrix working with WVD. I read a blog probably 3 months ago now, and that person called it EVD, Enterprise Virtual Desktop, which is basically the entitlement that comes with M365. And I love that. I love the concept of actually calling it something specific when you're talking about it specifically versus WVD, which is even more specific. It's kind of like a tissue versus a Kleenex. Everybody calls a tissue a Kleenex, and really a Kleenex is just a type of tissue. Is it fair to call it Enterprise Virtual Desktop EVD, or has that term been retired?
I think it's fair as well. Now, the one thing with, at least when you say enterprise, and this is kind of where Citrix comes into play as well, is the whole Windows Virtual Desktop concept, DVD, multi-session Win 10, like that brokering. A lot of it is really a fairly V1 product. There are going to be customers that it meets the needs, but when it comes to bringing forward a full enterprise-ready end-to-end solution with the granularity that's required for that, it is a little bit of a misnomer, but it is just another term I've heard. And I think it's, how even with like Citrix Virtual App, people are still referring to as Zen App. You have Citrix Virtual App, Citrix Workspace Premium Plus, a lot of the different terminologies. I think it's, just one of the multitude that kind of covers the entire platform.
Do you think it's fair to say that the murkiness of WVD, just like when the murkiness of Kleenex, is actually a good thing for Microsoft and some people, because now, I'm sure Kleenex loves the fact that everybody calls a tissue a Kleenex, whether it's a Kleenex or not. Yeah,
Azure is, especially with the enterprise level of engagement and just what they've been doing in terms of just looking at like Windows Defender, for example. I remember like a couple years ago, no one would consider using, Windows Defender just compared to some of the other products that are out there. And then just their engagement with, building off of this platform to really drive an end-to-end, enterprise solution, investing in things like, Azure Security Graph, pulling in their AV that's built into every OS, having analytics on top of it, and continue to drive that enterprise, level of need through their platform. I think they're really driving the mold when it comes to consuming, obviously, their operating system in their cloud, because they're building all these integrations that are very powerful. So, I would agree. And I think that's why, from a Citrix perspective, a lot of our use cases tend to be, we can run everywhere. And I think that's one of the advantages of Citrix. But I know at least a lot of customers in the enterprise space, due to how Microsoft is really tailoring their solutions to really hit some core enterprise needs, we're seeing a lot of workloads on Azure, I think, for that reason as well.
Yeah, I think this is a further example of the Citrix and Microsoft relationship, which you're probably going to touch on here in a minute. But it's not a competitive thing. It's adding value to the WVD, or the Enterprise Virtual Desktop, or the desktop in Azure as a service, however we're going to call it, in the long run. it adds value to that, and there's truly a mutual benefit for both companies as well as for the customer by doing so. So let's go on to the next one, which I think is going to kind of highlight that a little bit. I guess I should preface this by saying, do what you can to hit the target here, but let's don't spend an hour and a half on this one. How does Citrix integrate with Windows Virtual Desktop, aka WVD?
So thinking of Windows Virtual Desktop, again, being the platform, and highlighting what we mentioned before, where, Microsoft, as our a partner, they give us entitlement to use, that secret sauce of WVD, the net new use case of a multi-session client OS desktop. Citrix, running on Azure with Citrix Cloud, we can leverage that use case, that experience, with our, VDA. So it's something where all of the brokering and session management, you're going to be using the Citrix Cloud platform to use that integration. So getting all the secret sauce of Citrix that we've covered in our last podcast, which was, I think, a few podcasts ago, if we want to get into the nitty gritty, leveraging, our platform, you can use bring your own licensing and, those Windows WVD entitlements I mentioned before around security updates, FS logics, multi-session Win10 with all the granularity and control and, hybridization. For example, I want to run things on AWS because I built a web app there. You can do all that the same by using Citrix on top of that.
Would it be fair to kind of recap that by saying Citrix is the icing on the cake that makes WVD an enterprise-worthy product? And maybe there's some others out there that do it, but I mean, Citrix has 30 years now of making that happen and continuing to make that happen. Is Citrix the enterprise icing on the cake for WVD? And by enterprise, I mean real-world business use case.
I would say definitely, because workloads don't get into Azure overnight. And like thinking of I need a platform and the user experience, and if I'm moving an app, if I'm shifting to SaaS, if I need to shift to infrastructure as a service, a lot of key enterprise applications, they're only going to run as well as their proximity to the data is. So having your front end and shifting all of your desktops to Azure, but then leaving all of your back ends or like critical services on premises, the user experience, productivity, stability is going to suffer, especially for applications that can't tolerate that separation. So even just thinking of enterprise or not enterprise, there's going to need to be a transitionary period. There's going to be hybridization in your organization. For the foreseeable future, for a long duration, whichever. Just as thinking of like that concept of, okay, I have Azure now. How do I make sure I have a user experience that transitions my enterprise to Azure without disrupting that end user? Just that alone, I think, is one of the key pieces to like why Citrix, outside of all the feature parameters and things along those lines, is how do you make this change in a way that is not impactful to your business?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, I'm going to make this crazy comment to you just now. I just realized that I am on Wi-Fi in this conversation. Normally, I make a massive effort to be on wired. If you're a Citrix guy and you've been around, the 25 years I've been around the product, it's so great to be at a point in time in technology history where wired or wireless, in some cases, doesn't matter anymore. That makes Citrix sessions so much better. I don't know. I can't believe I get excited about that, but I do. So let's go on to the next topic. Can I still use...
So like 5G LTE and everything too.
It's only getting better. It's only getting better.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Can I still use a new or existing storefront and or Citrix ADC, NetScaler, Citrix ADC, Application Delivery Controller, formerly called NetScaler, deployment when using the Citrix integration of Windows Virtual Desktop?
This is one of those ones where I always wish I had a whiteboard, but thinking of just podcasts being an audio-only experience, I'll try to be as descriptive as possible. And I think one of the best advantages, and this really hits on that key theme of hybridization, I'm going to be orchestrating my business across multiple data centers and clouds. Like, how do I do this in a way that's not impactful to an end user? Citrix overall, when we architected Citrix Cloud, we wanted the same concept when it came to our existing customer base. We have customers that have, integrated and deployed storefront. They've deployed Citrix ADC into their organization. And while, the cloud version of those capabilities with workspace and gateway service are available, making that transition from an access experience, authentication, user workflows, et cetera, we wanted to make sure it was done in a way where there's hybridization. So when you think of the virtual app and desktop service, that's the brokering, that's the control layer. And then you're thinking of, Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session, that's a workload. It's, a VDA running in Azure. So that storefront, that Citrix ADC, it just sees a virtual app and desktop service as another Citrix site. That site just happens to be one maintained by our organization in Citrix Cloud rather than having a customer to use it. So that's the main piece. Like using the Citrix Cloud service is what's required to use that multi-session experience with Windows. It's not dependent on where the access is. So customers that are looking to make that transition that already have existing Citrix investments, or for example, they're a net new customer where just a key, authentication or security parameter. Hey, we don't want to send any passwords to the cloud. Like we want to have, a storefront or ADC, within our data center because of like the caching or like additional redundancy features. They can leverage and, that bring your own access layer when it comes to their architecture and use all the benefits that we've described prior. So think of, it's very, the Citrix architecture is very modular, and this is just an example of how modular it can be.
Yeah, you took the word right out of my mouth, and that's the modular world. When we went from IMA to FMA, I ran around telling everybody how modular it was and how it was going to be cloud friendly when it was time to move to the cloud. And I honestly, at the time, I didn't know what I was saying in hindsight, but truly, you can take different components, different modules of the Citrix virtual app and desktop solution, and you can aggregate them with clouds as well as being able to provide them from clouds. And that's really, kudos to Citrix for putting that in the right direction and being prepared for this multi-cloud world with the modular concept. That's great.
Exactly. And thinking of too, like the cloud version of, storefront and ADC, like I mentioned with, Citrix Workspace and like the gateway service, one thing I always like to highlight to customers, because especially now that we have, Citrix Intelligent Workspace is GA and, going to that full cloud experience is going to become more and more compelling over time as it continues to evolve. What I always love to highlight to customers is that's just another URL. There isn't any licensing entitlement for storefront there. I mean, there is for Citrix ADC, but that aside, when it comes to like use cases and like trying to shift to the cloud, even within an organization, hey, we're going to have, our IT go to, the full cloud experience so we can drive innovation. And it's just going to be the URL that we encourage our end users to go to within, our technology sets of use cases. And then this other set of use cases, storefront ADC, let's go with what the users are used to because they're not as technical of an audience. So I always like to highlight to customers as well, it doesn't have to be all or nothing, even from an access experience. And as, customers look at the cloud and begin innovating, finding use cases that are more risk tolerant and can be more on the bleeding edge really allows, IT administrators to start getting a feel for the newest technology from a user experience perspective, while they start to transition, core end users and core lines of business to more cloud first technologies. Consuming that and being on the bleeding edge within, your IT shop's a great way to, ease into that transition, build more experience, build more expertise with Citrix, Microsoft, et cetera, because it really is just like another URL when you really think about it.
Yeah. No, I like it from that aspect too. I didn't really think about it that way, but you can kind of dip your toe in the water. You can jump all in. I've seen several customers jump all in, which was a massive mistake. And that's not to say they shouldn't have bought Citrix, Workspace Premium Plus as a service or virtual app and desktop service. One of the nice things is you can go the model of subscription, which has its accounting benefits, but at the same time you can roll out the technology as you see fit if you acquire it the correct way. And so sometimes I've seen people not do that. They try to go from one to the other literally in the matter of an hour. I saw a customer do this and I was shocked, and it failed, and rightfully so. And honestly, that was on the customer more than it was Citrix. But all right, so next conversation here is what are the provisioning options available when using Citrix with Azure? The MCS, PVS conversations have been a debate forever. The cloud helps solve that one. So let's see your answer on that.
Yeah, and that's good. Yeah, exactly. When it comes to Citrix, thinking back to like the MCS versus PBS, one of the things that PBS always had on MCS was at just like a macro level was, hey, I need to stream to a physical device. We have workstations. So that was one of those check boxes that automatically, you have to do provisioning services. Machine creation services is the same concept. I want to put workloads on Azure, AWS, GCP. Machine creation services is the provisioning mechanism to get that done. So like a lot of our existing customers who've invested in PBS, and have been doing, provisioning services for years, this is a much different experience from an administrative perspective. It's simpler because everything's done in Studio. But, thinking of existing images, removing those PBS tools, getting them to Azure, getting your team used to the operational tasks of, changing catalogs through machine creation services, that tends to be, a challenge, for some customers to learn a new technology, test it, and potentially maintain, two different provisioning mechanisms in parallel. That's where things like app layering can be very helpful, because now if you've built your images for PBS, that has the tools that go with, that technology. I want to transition all of my, images from that on-premises hypervisor, different provisioning mechanism to Azure and use, the MCS that's within Azure. Layering is where, that's when customers really start to realize that value of that investment in layering, is because now it's a new platform. I've just forklifted all of my images to the cloud and using machine creation services, since that's the only option. But from a Citrix perspective, though, as well, is we've been making a lot of investments in MCS to get it to parity in certain ways, like with the offloading I/O to memory, and like the write cache with hard disk overflow within PBS. As of 1903, the drivers for those technologies have merged. So customers that want to have like a persistent data disk for like files like event logs or, the WEM cache can now do that on machine creation services in Azure. But long story short, that's the way to provision in the cloud, unless you have an orchestration team that's going to do a ton of stuff with ARM templates and you want to, bring your own provisioning. So, taking the time, if you're planning on going to Azure, planning on going to public cloud, just spinning up a catalog like in your on-premises hypervisor, getting used to, that management experience, if you haven't seen it already, is something I would highly encourage.
Yeah, I mean, MCS works these days well, and it's got a lot of the benefits
exactly
have all by itself, and keep it simple. And one of my favorite things about MCS is it doesn't require me to battle my network team every time. In the beginning, getting it set up, as well as once you have it rolled out, the network can have a massive impact on the PBS world, whereas MCS, it's much less impactful.
Exactly. And especially when you look at like hyper-converged infrastructures like with Nutanix and simplifying the storage conversation. And just the sheer magnitude of just how much storage performance has improved over the last 5+ years. I continue to ask customers, especially if they're looking at cloud and they're doing something net new, hey, let's keep it simple, and if machine creation services, which has really evolved over the last 5 years tremendously, consider that challenge requirements that existed previously and that might not exist today based on technology change. Because if you can make it simple and then provide the same user experience, why have a complexity that doesn't need to be there?
Hey, real quick, going back to app layering, that's yet another concept of modular, making modular pieces out of the environment. When you said that around app layering, were you specifically talking about image layers or elastic layers or both?
So that would be the platform layer is something that cannot be elastically layered. So that would be the concept of a layered image. So I have my Lego factory that has all my bits and pieces of my operating system, the platform I'm going to run it on, and then all of my applications. That platform layer, when it comes to layering, is the highest priority when you do merge that, build a set of building blocks together to get your final output. So the platform layer is always built into that base. Elastic layering is a great way to go from I want to transport my image across platforms for an OS to I want to reduce my image count. That's more where elastic layering can come into play. I even see it a lot with testing. Like I have my OS and my platform. I'm an app owner. I'm going to go to just a pool of virtual machines, and I'm going to log in and I'm going to get my app layer to me elastically, test it before I merge it into the final layered image. it's something where, it's another tool in the tool belt. It's not an end all be all. And actually thinking of that same concept with 1912, that whole elastic layer concept of I'm logging in and I'm merging something real time into that operating system. It's going to act like it's running locally. We actually did that as well with the user layer, which used to be fully dependent on app layering. It's now actually built into the VDA as of 1912. So the official PBD replacement is now built into the product with the next LTSR, and it uses similar technologies to the concept of elastic layering for server operating systems with app layering.
That sounds like yet another podcast. So if that's something that you or somebody you want to recommend, that's definitely one we need to jump on. All right.
I still got to get my hands on it a little bit, but I think it's an exciting change because there are a few PBD customers that existed out there, and we're looking for, what is the future state of that. And I'm glad we finally have something that came out with the next LTSR.
Yeah, no,
the new LTSR.
Let's at least jump on and talk about it. So, okay, next question is, what is the recommended Azure instance type for Citrix virtual app and desktop workloads?
So this is a great one. And for those listening, if you listen in the next couple of weeks, I'll go with this. And the one thing that's fun about cloud is it's always changing, especially as people change pricing models and release new instances. But from a Citrix perspective, Citrix tends to be a compute dominant workload where, compute tends to be the bottleneck. And, leading into this year back in 2018, we saw that, F series instances, which is the compute optimized for Azure, think of every dollar you're spending towards that instance, that infrastructure as a service, more of that dollar is going towards compute versus storage performance, network performance, or memory. F series used to be the recommended instance, but what we've been seeing, especially as more browser based and memory intensive workloads are becoming more and more prevalent, is the running our login VSI testing, especially with some of the larger instances. We were starting to see memory bottlenecks were really starting to drive down performance, and a lot of what we've seen in the field, we've seen similar items, especially in a multi-session scenario where you have now this chunk of memory that's being divvied up across more and more users who happen to be probably opening up a ton of browser tabs. So what we recommend now from a starting point is the D series, particularly the DB2. Microsoft, a few years back when they went from that older series, everything from a hardware perspective was 1-to-1 from a CPU overcommit ratio. There was no overcommitment, but getting to newer technologies, they started doing, overcommitment of CPU and, at a cheaper price, driving down some performance. So the DB2 series, that older one, actually provided the best dollar per user per hour. So what we're recommending to customers, if that one's available, to start there, test the workload. If it's not, to leverage the DB3 series because memory might be a bottleneck, and then adjust accordingly. One of the great things about Azure is the ability to change your instance type on the fly. So, for example, thinking back of the day of just on premises, hey, we got to do a scalability test because you need to make capital expense. We want to do it with data, so you're not buying too much or too little hardware, so you can be efficient as a business. Cloud, breaks that a little bit because now you can, you can fail fast because the liability is much lower. You're spinning it up. It's too small. We're going to, go and let's reboot and retest and then, talk to our finance team and change our forecast a little bit. So we always recommend customers start there, refine as needed based on their workloads. And then once you go through that refinement process, then have a conversation about instance reservations where you pay for, a year to 3 years of capacity to get a discount, because typically there's going to be workloads that are going to always be on for, non-peak times. Usually it's about 10% of the overall workload. So you can save some costs and have guaranteed capacity in your public cloud. So it's multifaceted process. It really takes, breaking out the concept of, scalability and thinking much more agilely, and, you can go and you can test, you can iterate because you have that flexibility. So, guidance, mileage may vary, but that's that's a good starting point for you.
Yeah, and that's where our technical brains, which historically have been all wrapped around buying more than you need, those have to turn into technical business brains where we figure out what's the appropriate way to attack this. You talked about login VSI. That's a great example of why those guys are going to be more and more relevant going forward, but we got to get smart about that and that's where your auto scaling technologies that you guys have evolved and continue to evolve will help.
Yeah, definitely. And Login VSI has been a great partner too, especially as we continue to refine our recommendations for cloud scalability. That's where we've driven most of our analysis is in collaboration with their team.
Yeah, one of the things I try to remind my Microsoft counterparts when I meet with them, and everybody's had their head wrapped around Azure and server workloads all these years, man, there's nothing that consumes workloads like desktops and server desktops and application servers, client-side application servers. Those have the potential to really get the Azure meter spinning, which can be a good thing. Get that out of your data center, but at the same time, we got to be diligent and strategic about how we implement those and scale them up and scale them down and do the things that need to happen on a day-to-day basis, and not just let the server sit there and run all the time and look at the blinking lights. Those days are gone.
Yeah, it's like I think I like to compare it to like a law of thermodynamics. You're taking energy and it's got to be created or destroyed. It's something's got to go somewhere. So like Microsoft is making Azure, AWS, they're making all this investment in infrastructure. So other than some workloads, maybe like DR or things that are really ephemeral, I got to run this for a month and then it's out of my data center. Those are the ones where the cost benefit may exist. But thinking of I'm getting out of the data center business. Doing that as a cost play outside of maybe certain DR use cases is, I'd say, 9 times out of 10, you end up getting into a scenario where you're at parity or more expensive. But the benefit then is, one, stability, because now there's a lot more consistency because I'm not the one managing the infrastructure. It's managed as a service by the vendor who owns it, as well as agility. So like I now can spin up a new data center in Europe without having to go reach out and work with an ISP, find hardware space, rack servers, pay for power, build those contracts for a data center, et cetera. So that, cost differential, like going in public cloud for like cost savings is usually where I see a lot of customers stumble a little bit, especially if they don't, really understand their use cases and how much they need to exist. So like how ephemeral is this use case? Is it a 3-month set of, we're in retail and it's the holidays and these users need to exist, or it's DR, it's mostly sitting off for a specific point of time. So I always recommend customers think about it as agility, around capability, around, being able to better react to change or be more competitive because of how closely they're going to be able to, stay up to date with the latest and greatest and not having to go through those maintenance cycles and using those soft costs to maintain their hardware and talk through it that way. And especially, for those who are listening, if you're building a business case, around any cloud technologies, to really try to think of it from that angle and, really focus on how long does this need to exist in my data center if you're going to be positioning something as like a cost savings. Because that's where, I see a lot of customers when they present to leadership, we're going to do cloud, and then it's something that needs to be always on 24/7, and then it's not where they want it to be from a cost perspective. It can really derail some very strategic projects within an organization.
Yes, I think it's really important that people look at this as a cloud strategy, or better yet, a cloud strategy, and one of those could be leveraging a partner like XenTegra. You could use us to offload some of your virtual app and desktop workloads while doing it in Azure simultaneously, and you can move them from one to the other as needed, and as the meter starts to overheat, you can use one or the other with a clouds type of strategy. I have a question for you on this topic, though. A lot of people are using Microsoft. A lot of people are using infrastructure as a service from someone else. It's cloud. A lot of people are using their own data center as their cloud. Citrix virtual app and desktop services and those associated with it, those are all housed in Azure these days, I believe. And it really, for me and you, it really doesn't matter because it's just a service that connects to other clouds as a service. So it's not a big deal, really. But do you have any of the latest information on if Citrix plans to spin up the control plane in any of the other clouds, either for, customer related reasons or for, DR, business continuity reasons, where you're not totally relying on Azure to host those control plane workloads?
So that's something, unfortunately, I'm not too privy to when it comes to expansion. But I know at least for a lot of customers, especially from a Citrix perspective, from like a DR, and, what is Citrix doing for availability, backup, And Citrix Cloud, a lot of it's Azure. There are, just like any other cloud customer, that when you look at a cloud strategy, it's going to entail a lot of different technologies. But one place I always recommend customers look at, especially when it comes to understanding how do we maintain our cloud, is there's a great resource called the Citrix Trust Center. That actually, if you Google Citrix Trust Center, goes through our security, privacy, and compliance. Like, what are we doing for backup? What are we doing for DR? What are we doing for security? Things along those lines. And that's something that we're continuing to update and maintain as our strategy evolves. And one of the cool things about that site is if you go to the privacy and compliance page, and click cloud resources, you could actually see all of the different services and like where we're hosting them throughout the world. It doesn't get into vendor specific. Again, just like any other customer, when it comes to leveraging Azure, there always tends to be a lot of different cloud services in play, whether it be SaaS with things like Workday or leveraging like a Google Analytics for like data gathering. Citrix is the same as well. And to get a good idea of just again how we run our cloud, that Trust Center is probably the best resource.
That's great. And, like you and I both know it really shouldn't matter, but sometimes customers get hung up on, where the control plane is and whether it's in the same cloud ecosystem or not. So it's, it's definitely a conversation to be had, but I appreciate the feedback there. So Kevin, we're at the end of at the end of the podcast here. You've covered everything in the blog. Is there anything else that you'd want people to know about either Kevin or this topic before we kind of let you leave us?
Yeah, I think a lot of it hits on, Andy, what you mentioned before. A lot of customers really care about, where, and I think that's the great thing about, especially getting just to the beginning, what we talked about, that how Citrix Cloud is a platform is, for us, it doesn't really matter where the workloads are. And that's also another, why Citrix on top of WVD is thinking of like a customer's cloud strategy and getting to the point where they're more of a cloud broker. They're brokering services or workloads across, XenTegra, across, Azure, across their own public data, private data center, et cetera. Citrix Cloud doesn't care where things exist, and you can run and orchestrate your workloads, regardless of where they're located and what cloud vendor. And I think that's one thing that when customers really look at, flexibility and gaining leverage, and tying back to some of the Microsoft conversation you had before, hey, we got to do some workloads in, AWS to diversify, just in case they do something, as a business that's different, or we have a workload that needs to be there. So diversification is very critical. And I think a lot of what we're doing from a Citrix Cloud strategy is really enabling that. But definitely appreciate the time as always. And thanks for having me on. Yeah, no, great, Kevin. And again, every time we do this, I think that we just probably need to do it once a week. That may be too much, right? Once a month. I'll just, as you produce content that goes out on the Citrix blog site, definitely make sure you point me to it so we can, I'm sure most of it will be a good fit, but make sure we don't miss it. No, I appreciate it. And even just the cost consider, we could probably do a whole session just on that in terms of, pay as you go versus reserve versus hybrid use benefit, like what timings you need to think about. Each of these questions probably have an entire podcast tied to them. So I definitely appreciate the time, and I'll keep them coming as we continue to collaborate and the technologies continue to evolve. Yeah, they may actually have an entire series with each of these questions and many more. Exactly. All right, well, sir, thank you for the time here, and hopefully people got a lot of value out of it. We'll do it again at a later date. Thank you. Perfect. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks for listening to the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton. A special thanks to our guests. Podcast produced by Pete Downing. Head over to XenTegra.com/podcast to listen to all podcasts in this series.